Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar, Chemicals Quarterly Q1 2026 Regulatory Update. It's great to see so many of you on today for our very popular webinar. A little bit of orientation about the webinar platform before I introduce our speakers for today. The webinar slides are available to your left side of the screen, along with a few helpful links if you would like to explore and learn more about how compliance and risks can help simplify and accelerate your compliance processes. We want this webinar to be as engaging as possible, so please send us any questions you may have, and we will aim to address them during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. If you would like to submit a question for the Q&A session, you can use the Ask a Question widget on the left side of your screen. We will also follow up with you directly for any questions that we don't get to answer during today's session. At any time, if you are interested in having a member of our team follow up with you, don't hesitate to use the Start a Conversation button at the bottom of your screen. Last but not least, the webinar recording will be sent to you within 24 hours. My name is Emer Walsh. I'm the Field Marketing Manager at Compliance and Risks. Today, we are joined by the very wonderful Kim Plashy, Senior Regulatory Content Specialist on the Content Research and Development team. Thank you, Kim. Kim Plashy is a Senior Regulatory Content Specialist on the Content Research and Development team, specialising in international product safety legislation, with a strong focus on chemicals in products and environmental regulation. She stays at the forefront of the evolving regulatory landscape. Kim holds a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Studies and a Master of Library Science, both from the University of Buffalo. Before joining CNR, Kim gained extensive experience in university, public and private libraries. She is also a published author with articles and research contributions featured in peer-reviewed journals and academic texts. Additionally, Kim has significant experience in the consumer products testing industry and has provided research and technical support for both internal testing teams and external clients. We're also joined today by the wonderful Cassie Pershin, who is a Senior Regulatory Content Specialist on the Content Research and Development team. Cassie is, as I said, a Senior Regulatory Content Specialist. She is responsible for the creation and management of essential regulatory information. A librarian by training with 16 years experience in the consumer products industry, she specializes in global research for clients across the supply chain. She is based in the Buffalo, New York office and currently enjoys a focus on product labeling and chemical restrictions, as well as her participation in ASTM standards development.
Thank you.
Before we kick off today's, thank you, Kim. Before we kick off today's webinar, I would like to provide a brief background about compliance and risks for those who are joining this series for the first time. At Compliance and Risks, our mission is to help ensure global companies have the tools and information to build safe, sustainable products in a world full of change. We are the trusted product compliance technology provider for the world's leading brands. We have spent 2 decades honing the digital tools, expertise, and content you need to stay ahead of the dynamic regulatory landscape and prove your product's compliance, protecting your brands and helping drive your growth. At Compliance and Risks, we have the world's most comprehensive regulatory database with over 100,000 regulations historically available in C2P. With a global regulatory coverage and expertise across over 10 industries, we understand that regulatory compliance doesn't sleep. Our regulatory experts team is truly global, with 28 languages collectively spoken across the team, and are fortified by our 30 knowledge partners. C2P is our enterprise software designed to keep global organizations on top of regulatory changes and their impact worldwide. This includes early warning alerts, impact probability, productivity workflow tools, and so much more. With that, I would like to hand it over to you, Kim.
Great. Thank you so much, Emer. Welcome, everybody. Happy to see you again this quarter. Just our regular agenda that we're going to start off with me covering the western side of the globe before handing it over to Cassie to close us out. Starting off with South America, we've actually had quite a bit happening there recently, not just this quarter, but the past year. Um, we have some brand new news to start us off is with Brazil. They have a proposal in right now to regulate substances specifically in children's cosmetics. This is PL 268. This was introduced in early February and it targets endocrine disrupting substances in children's cosmetics. Specific chemicals that are listed in the proposal include mercury, parabens, lead, phthalates, BPA, among others. At this point, the proposed law hasn't had any movement since March, but if it is enacted, it will enter into force in 180 days. Heading over to Chile, where there's nothing new, but I do want to remind attendees that there is a deadline looming. This applies specifically to companies that need to re-notify hazardous industrial substances that were first reported back in 2024. That deadline is August 30th of this year. It includes all hazardous substances that intended for industrial use specifically that were manufactured or imported during 2024 and 25 if that quantity was more than 1 ton per year. Those that have not yet registered will need to do so as new substances. The country's chemical substances notification platform includes Excel spreadsheets and more information regarding the deadline, as well as those national inventory lists. We have a similar situation in Colombia. Back in May 2025, all substance registrations were due. That means that the annual update will be due 1 month after Chile's is due on September 30th. This report must include volumes for 2025. Registration will also be required for new substances or newly registered if that deadline was missed last year. Exact details for new substance requirements, though, have not yet been released. In Peru, this is actually from this quarter, Q2, but I wanted to get a timely update out to everybody. The country has formally adopted Supreme Decree number 5 of 2026. This was published on April 8th, and the regulation triggers a complex life cycle based framework for all chemical substances. This landmark regulation, which implements Legislative Decree 1570, effectively adopts another REACH-like lifecycle management system for chemicals. The decree specifically states that it will enter into force 6 months after publication. Given the April publication, that will place us in October. However, the ministry has built in a substantial period to prevent market disruption. It officially runs from January 1st, 2028 until September 30th, 2031. During that window, manufacturers and importers must transition to the 6th revised edition of the GHS for classification, labeling, and safety data sheets. Starting January 1st, 2032, any substance that is not registered during the transition will be legally classified as a new substance. These new substances, along with those designated as prioritized substances, will be subject to mandatory industry-funded risk assessments. Continuing up north, starting in Central America, Guatemala notified the World Trade Organization of a draft regulation for health control of pharmaceutical and related products in February. Related products is defined broadly to include precursor chemicals, pesticides, cosmetics, and medical devices. Once this is adopted, a transition window of 18 months would be granted for government agencies to overhaul their infrastructure. In a March addendum to the original TBT notice, Guatemala officially changed the final date for comments on this to May 12th, so there is still time to review and comment. Also in February, the Mexican Chamber of Deputies introduced a bill to add provisions to the general health law relating to certain substances. The proposal seeks to prohibit the manufacture, import, and marketing of cosmetic products in Mexico if they contain one of 5 substances, namely formaldehyde 1,4-dioxane, PFAS, trimethylbenzoyl diphenylphosphine oxide, or dimethylptoluidine. If the proposal is enacted, the amendments would come into force the day following their publication in the country's official gazette. Heading into some news for the United States, starting at the federal level, we have some proposals related to the Toxic Substances Control Act. On January 21st, the U.S. House proposed Bill number 7181 to amend TSCA to clarify the exemption for replacement parts. The bill aims to generally exempt replacement parts for complex goods from regulation unless they are proven to significantly contribute to human health risks. It also allows for continued supply of necessary chemicals for those replacement parts and requires at least a 10-year transition period for any restrictions on those. The EPA is also proposing an extension for the reporting deadline for the health and safety data reporting rule under TSCA by 1 year to May 21st, 2027. The proposed extension is intended to delay compliance with the one-time reporting rule during EPA's ongoing reconsideration of it. They are seeking public comment on the proposed action, and the comments are due today. On February 6th, EPA proposed routine updates to the TSCA formaldehyde standards for composite wood. The key change is the addition of ISO 12460 Part 2 as an approved quality control test method. Additionally, the EPA is updating several voluntary standards to their current 2022 and 2023 versions from ANSI, ASTM, and ISO. This does not change existing emission limits or impact the EPA's separate ongoing formaldehyde risk evaluation. The comment period for this closed back in March. In January, EPA officially recommitted to the goal of eliminating all mammalian animal testing by 2035, specifically related to TSCA and FIFRA. This is a shift back to the 2019 roadmap, prioritizing new approach methods such as in vitro. Okay, so I'm once again moving outside of our regular Q1 coverage to include something notable that happened just a few weeks ago in this quarter. On April 6, EPA signed a final rule to officially recognize that the submission period for the PFAS reporting rule will now begin on January 31st, 2027, or 60 days following the effective date of a forthcoming final rule on the requirements of that rule, whichever one is earlier. So it's either January 31st, 2027, or 60 days following the finalization. The EPA states on their website that this is an effort to simultaneously allow more time for companies to prepare, but also to give them a chance to review the comments received on the proposed updates from November 2025. The final rule was published earlier last week in the Federal Register. EPA also made some moves related to sodium perfluorohexanyl sulfonate. The administration added the substance to the toxic release inventory list of reportable chemicals. With that addition, 206 PFAS substances are now on the TRI list. Reporting for the added substance is required beginning with the 2026 reporting year. In addition to those final measures related to PFAS, in March, the Forever Chemical Regulation and Accountability Act was reintroduced in the U.S. Senate. S 4153 establishes a rigorous 10-year countdown for the elimination of PFAS from the U.S. economy. The most immediate impact would hit in April 2027. In this month, a hard ban would take effect for several high-volume categories, including carpets, rugs, fabric treatments, and food packaging. That would be followed in April 2028 by bans on cosmetics, apparel, and indoor furnishings. By April 2029, every manufacturer and user would be required to submit a comprehensive public phase-out plan to the EPA. Simultaneously, the EPA will finalize a rule requiring annual disclosures of specific chemical identities, molecular structures, and all environmental release volumes by April 2036. To date, hair straightening products are regulated at the state level in the United States and deal with multiple carcinogens or reproductive toxicants. You might recall that last quarter we discussed the enactment of the New York Assembly Bill in November. Their law tackles the issue with warning label requirements. However, on February 27th, the U.S. House proposed Bill 7685, which would classify hair straightening or smoothing products that contain any amount of formaldehyde or formaldehyde-releasing substances as adulterated cosmetics, and that would prevent them from being distributed or sold in commerce. The bill also requires the commissioner of the U.S. FDA, in consultation with the director of the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, to conduct a study on the short and long-term health impacts of exposure to the substances, particularly for salon workers, and to then report findings and recommendations to Congress. If this one is enacted, it would come into effect in 180 days. I do typically like to separate my state and federal discussions in the webinars, but this seems like a good time to remind everybody that Colorado proposed a bill related to this topic in early March. This one deals with hair relaxer products and synthetic hair pieces that contain carcinogens or reproductive toxicants. The covered products would be required to contain a warning label that notifies the consumer that the covered hair product contains a carcinogen or reproductive toxicant. This is like the New York bill or the New York law that has passed. In a related bill, Senate Bill 2275, which was proposed in New Jersey this quarter, it just covers synthetic hair products like hair pieces. Under that bill, carcinogens, reproductive toxicants, volatile organic compounds, and flame-resistant chemicals would be prohibited from being intentionally added to those hair products. And that leads us into our discussion for states in general. We are starting off alphabetically with California. DTSC is proposing to add specific manual dish detergents, shampoos, and leave-on products as priority products. DTSC published a draft regulation targeting 1,4-dioxane in manual dish detergents and shampoos, and it sets a strict concentration threshold of 1 part per million. If a product exceeds this limit, it is officially classified as a priority product under the Safer Consumer Products regulations. Simultaneously, the DTSC is expanding its focus to skin-applied leave-on products. The department has identified butylparaben and formaldehyde-releasing preservatives as high-priority substances for those categories. Butylparaben is flagged as a known endocrine disruptor, while formaldehyde is cited as a human carcinogen and a potent respiratory and dermal sensitizer. Comments for the 1,4-dioxane proposal were due March 2nd and the leave-on products by March 31st, so those have both passed. Once finalized, these listings trigger mandatory priority product notifications and the commencement of preliminary alternative analysis reports for all affected manufacturers. The DTSC is also proposing to amend the Safer Consumer Products regulations to add 12 specific acids and bases to the candidate chemicals list. They are listed on my slide here on the right. DTSC may identify and list one or more product chemical combinations that it determines to be of high priority as a priority product. DTSC's decision to identify and list a product chemical combination is based on an evaluation of potential exposures and adverse impacts. Only products that contain one or more chemicals on that list can be identified as priority products, so that would include all of these. The comments on this were due March 30th. So this quarter, Minnesota is considering HF 4257 to amend Minnesota Statute Section 116.943. If that is enacted, manufacturers would see the notification requirement for intentionally added PFAS pushed back from the current 2026 window to July 2027. The bill also would introduce a robust framework for currently unavoidable uses. Under the proposed subsection 5F, the state recognizes the technical necessity of PFAS in complex supply chains, including critical exemptions for motor vehicles, aircraft, and more. Furthermore, the bill acknowledges the reality of long-lived multi-component products, allowing for the continued use of PFAS where these materials are integrated into systems with such extended useful lives. However, more immediately regarding the reporting window, very recently on April 15th, MPCA officially extended the initial reporting deadline to September 15th, 2026, extending it 2.5 months. Apologies for not including that on the slide here, as it was a very recent update and actually, again, outside of that Q1 highlight coverage. But since it happened in the last 2 weeks and it is something we are all watching closely, I wanted to be sure to let everybody know now. The new PRISM portal is officially live, despite the proposed legislative delays in HF 4257. That current regulatory requirement is now in September. When utilizing PRISM, companies have to be prepared for 2 important factors. First, there is a one-time reporting fee of $800. Also, the MPCA has stated that all of the information submitted, unless it is explicitly identified and justified as a trade secret, will then be accessible to the public. In March, New Mexico's Environmental Improvement Board approved the long-awaited labeling rules for products containing intentionally added PFAS. These requirements are for the manufacturers and used products, pesticides, veterinary products, and medical devices and drugs are exempt. As of the end of Q1, the final rule wasn't published, but based on the final proposed rule, among other specifications for the label, we know it must clearly inform the consumer that the product contains PFAS and appear as an outline of an Erlenmeyer flask with the word PFAS inside of the flask. In addition to establishing labeling requirements, the board also adopted the reporting requirements for phasing out the sale of certain consumer products containing intentionally added PFAS. Beginning in 2027, the law prohibits the sale of certain products with intentionally added PFAS in items like cookware, food packaging, and juvenile products. In 2028, we will see cosmetics, furniture, carpets, cleaning products, and more included. Finally, by 2032, all non-exempt products will be prohibited. There were many, as you can imagine, bills related to PFAS introduced this quarter. I simply just don't have the time to really discuss each of these, but I've highlighted a few of the more notable bills on the slide here. Please always be sure to refer to the official text or C2P for product coverage and other nuances. And of course, always feel free to ask questions about these. We also have a significant amount of activity related to cosmetics ingredients across several key states this quarter. In the interest of time, I will just leave the citations and quick details here on the slide for you to review later, but we do welcome questions about this as well. We do have some news regarding microplastics to report. SB 274 was introduced in Vermont. Among restrictions on specific medical equipment containing DEHP, The bill proposes a prohibition of intentionally added plastic microbeads in personal care and specific cleaning products by January 2029. We'll keep tracking this one to see if Vermont joins Illinois and other states in banning microbeads in cosmetic products. The Rhode Island Senate introduced legislation to create their Microplastics Reduction Act. If theirs is enacted beginning January 1st, 2030, no manufacturer will be allowed to sell, offer for sale, or distribute any product containing intentionally added synthetic polymer microparticles. I do just want to highlight that this proposal's prohibition applies to all products rather than just cosmetics or cleaning products. If this one is enacted, it would enter into force upon passage. There were a few proposals relating to heavy metals in various products this quarter. I have pulled those into a little table here, but I do want to quickly go through those because heavy metals is an important topic. First of note is Minnesota's Senate File 4679. While this legislation mainly focuses on a formal stewardship program for batteries, it also includes a prohibition of the sale of any batteries containing intentionally added mercury. The New Jersey Senate introduced Bill 2075, which specifically targets toys, play equipment, or care items designed for those under the age of 6. It proposes to prohibit these children's products from containing lead, mercury, or cadmium. In a parallel move, New Jersey is also targeting cadmium in jewelry with a strict 0.03% weight limit. Finally, on January 5th, the Washington State Senate introduced SB 5975 to refine the regulation of lead in aluminum and brass cookware. This bill introduces a definition for intentionally added lead that excludes recycled content and prohibits its use starting January 2027. Finishing up in Canada, significant new activity notice number 22294 was published this quarter for zinc stannate. The notice requires any person intending to use zinc stannate as a nanomaterial above specified annual volume thresholds, which I've listed on the slide here, to submit a significant new activity notification with detailed information on use, volumes, exposure, and nanospecific physico-chemical and toxicological data at least 90 days before commencing the activity. This one came into effect immediately on March 7th. The Canadian Minister of the Environment issued 2 distinct ministerial conditions imposing strict controls on the manufacture and import of 2 specific substances. These are Ministerial Condition 22407 for specific siloxanes and 22313 for phenyl methylstyronated. For both substances, the Ministers of Environment and Health suspect toxicity under Section 64 of SEPA. Consequently, manufacture or import is permitted only by the original notifier. Before domestic manufacturing can even begin, notifiers must provide a comprehensive technical dossier to the minister at least 120 days in advance. The notification must detail annual volumes, facility locations, environmental release points, and specific disposal protocols. For the phenyl methylstyronated substance used in adhesives, application is restricted to enclosed spray booths or small quantities for minor maintenance. All containers and waste must be rinsed and then destroyed via incineration or disposal in engineered hazardous waste landfills. Both of the conditions mandate a closed-loop chain of custody, meaning that third-party transfers are only allowed after they have been the new representative has been informed of the conditions in writing and obtained a written agreement that they will comply. Finally, all compliance documentation must be maintained in English or French at the Canadian place of business for 5 years. Condition 22407 entered into force on January 27th, and 22313 entered into force February 19th. Finishing up with some news from Health Canada, they are addressing benzophenone exposure through a proposed code of practice for consumer paints, stains, and coatings. It follows a SEPA Section 64C finding that the substance constitutes a danger to human health via dermal and inhalation pathways. The code seeks to establish a maximum concentration of 0.2% weight by weight. Companies adopting the code must submit a baseline report by March 31st of the year following adoption, with follow-up reports due every 3 years. Records must be retained for at least 6 years. Health Canada does plan to review the program in its 6th year to evaluate market-wide progress. If these voluntary reductions are insufficient, the government has signaled that it will pursue formal regulatory mandates. The comment period for this closed on April 15th. And that is all for our side of the globe. Now I will pass it off to Cassie to get us started in Australia.
Thank you, Kim. Good stuff over there. I'm going to jump right in with the proposed expansion of Australia's Industrial Chemicals Environmental Management Standard, or ICHEMS. On March 23rd, the Department of Climate Change, Energy and the Environment and Water proposed 2 major amendments that will move more high-risk substances into Schedule 7, which of course represents the most restrictive category under the register. First, we have a proposed scheduling of several PFAS components, PFNS, PFDS, PFHPS, and the related salts, and a draft decision for TTBP and its sodium salt. If finalized, this decision effectively removes these substances from the Australian industrial market, with the exceptions for essential research and some articles that are already in use. The proposal does define unintentional trace contamination, or UTC, limits. For PFNS and PFDS, we are looking at a threshold of 0.025 milligrams per kilogram or 1 milligram per kilogram for related compounds. For TTBP, the focus is on preventing sham recycling. The regulation explicitly prohibits dilution as a means to bypass the Schedule 7 requirements. And if you have waste with concentrations above 1 milligram per kilogram or 40 milligrams per kilogram for total PFNS, PFDS related compounds, it cannot be reused or recycled. It must be destroyed or irreversibly transformed. The public consultation period ends next week on April 24th, with an expected adoption by June. The ban for PFNS, PFDS would take effect on January 1st of 2027. For TTBP, the rules trigger 12 months after the official register update. And then hopping right over into Europe, we have a January 2026 draft amendment to the REACH Annex 17. This proposed amendment specifically targets substances classified as CMRs, the carcinogenic, mutagenic, or toxic to reproduction. The proposal will reflect the new harmonized classifications we saw in the recent CLP updates, which was the EU regulations 2024/2564 and 2025/1222. If passed, any substance recently flagged under CLP would be restricted for consumer use under REACH. The draft clarifies the CAS numbers for 3 specific substances in Appendices 1 and 2 in order to eliminate any identification gray areas, and aligns the methodology for calculating CMR concentrations in mixtures. There is also a specific focus on dinitrogen oxide. There's a rising concern over its misuse as a recreational drug, so the Commission is introducing some strict derogations. So while it's still allowed for legitimate uses, there are now volume limits and age restrictions. For substances under the 2024 regulation, restrictions would kick in as soon as that regulation enters into force after May 2026. For those under the 2025 regulation, you would have until February 1st, 2027, and comments for this were due on February 6th. On March 17th, the European Commission published Regulation 2026/55. This amendment to Mercury framework is meant to keep the EU in line with the global community and the Minamata Convention that we discussed last quarter. Part A of Annex 2 now includes very high accuracy capacitance and loss measurement bridges, as well as high frequency radio switches and relays used in monitoring and control instruments. If these components contain 20 milligrams of mercury or more, they are now strictly regulated. If these specific bridges or switches are being used solely for research and development, the prohibition doesn't apply. Although the regulation was published and entered into force on March 20th, the actual prohibition date for manufacturers, import, and export was set for December 31st. As of March 31st, the ECHA has updated its voluntary list to help us identify which active substance and product type combinations are legal for use to treat articles. So, of course, under Article 58 of the Biocidal Products Regulation, you cannot place a treated article on the EU market unless the active substance is either approved or currently under review for that specific use. So Part 1 is the green list. These are the combinations that are either already approved and on the union list or are currently working their way through the review program. It's the safe zone for long-term product formulation. Part 2 is the sunset phase and requires immediate action and attention for risk management. This section lists substances that are being withdrawn, and once a non-approval decision is published, you have a strict 180-day grace period to get those products off the market. ECHA generally scrubs these from the list 7 months after a decision, so if you see a substance here, the clock is ticking. This section also highlights orphan substances where the last participant withdrew. So if that substance is critical to your business, there's definitely an opportunity to take over the role of participant to keep it alive. And then our Part 3 is emerging compliance and covers the newer entries, which are notifications for inclusion in the review program that have passed the initial compliance check. While the full approval application might not be due for another 2 years, these substances are legally allowed for use in the interim. This is often where we see redefined substances appear. And we'll move on to a PFAS update. In March, the European Chemicals Agency reached a critical milestone in the universal PFAS restriction proposal, and while the UK simultaneously launched its own national roadmap. So the EU Risk Assessment Committee, or RAC, has officially adopted its final opinion. They believe a full immediate ban, subject only to an 18-month transition, is the only way to manage the non-threshold risks of PFAS. They estimate this would prevent 3.3 million tons of emissions over 30 years. RAC is particularly skeptical of derogations. They've noted that broad exemptions would drop the effectiveness of the ban from 96% to just 76%, leaving 700,000 tons of avoidable chemicals in the environment. The EU Socio-Economic Analysis Committee, the SEAC, published its draft opinion just weeks later, providing a more pragmatic counterbalance. So while the SEAC agrees a group-wide restriction is needed, they are questioning whether a full ban is proportionate and are currently inviting industry feedback, specifically on 15 key sectors, to determine where 18 months is simply not enough time to find alternatives. The UK is charting its own course with their PFAS plan, building a safer future together. So unlike the EU's single massive restriction, the UK is using a multi-pillared framework. They're focusing on immediate risks like firefighting foams and textiles, while building the evidence base for a statutory limit in drinking water. The UK is aligning with the OECD definition of PFAS, which signals that their future REACH restrictions will likely mirror the breadth of the EU's scope. Even where uses are allowed to continue, both the EU and UK are moving toward a reporting and monitoring regime. So if you're granted an exception, expect mandatory state-specific PFAS management plans, strict labeling requirements, and annual emissions reporting to ECHA or UK authorities. The SEAC will adopt its final opinion by the end of 2026, and the European Commission will then draft the final amendment to REACH Annex 17 for the UK. For the UK, we expect a decision on firefighting foams in 2027 and a broader consumer product restriction to follow. Sticking with the UK, DEFRA published a draft statutory instrument on March 18th to add 5 substances to Annex 1 of their persistent organic pollutants regulation. This includes MCCPs, often used as flame retardants or plasticizers, long-chain PFCAs, UV328 dechlorine plus, and the insecticide chlorpyrifos. Once finalized, their manufacture, use, and placement on the market in Great Britain would be prohibited. Beyond the new listings, DEFRA is tightening the screws on substances they're already banned. So for PFOS, they are proposing much lower UTC limits, moving towards that 0.025 milligram per kilogram threshold we're seeing globally, and sets a 1 milligram per kilogram limit for the sum of LC-PFCA-related compounds. They are also looking for feedback on whether to match the EU's recent amendments for PBDE flame retardants. Comments are due by May 13th, and if the timeline holds, these rules would go into effect on December 16th of this year. On January 27th, the Switzerland Federal Council proposed changes to their chemical risk reduction ordinance, aligning its domestic bans with the latest EU standards and Stockholm and Minamata. Under Annex 1, restriction decisions regarding chlorpyrifos, MCCPS, and LCPFCAs are proposed at an incredibly low threshold of 25 parts per million. For MCCPs used in high-stakes environments like aerospace, defense, and specialized adhesives, we are looking at a gradual phase-out that stretches as far as 2031 to 2041, and this would give those specific industries the runway needed for rigorous safety testing of alternatives. Annex 1.7, in accordance with the Minamata Convention, would prohibit placing on the market a range of mercury-containing products, including switches, relays, sensors, vacuum pumps, wheel weights, photographic materials, and certain spacecraft propellants. Limited exemptions remain for mercury-containing components used as spare parts or in specific large-scale equipment and installations, and this is largely aligned with exemptions under the EU directive. Annex 1.16 introduces a broad prohibition on key PFAS groups, including PFOS, PFOA, PFCAs, and they set a very low concentration limit of 25 parts per billion for substances and 260 to 1,000 parts per billion for related compounds in substances, preparations, and articles. It also expands the definition of related substances to include precursors that degrade into regulated PFAS, while allowing limited exemptions for unavoidable trace impurities, certain fluoropolymers, specific industrial uses, and non-invasive medical devices under strict thresholds. The proposed effective date for the bulk of these changes is December 1st of 2026. However, some specific provisions have been pushed to August 1st of 2027 to allow for supply chain adjustments. And we do have a story out of Saudi Arabia today. On January 5th, the Saudi Arabian Ministry of Interior issued decision number 3090. This update to the executive regulations of the Chemicals Material Management System directly impacts how hazardous and dual-use chemicals are imported and tracked within Saudi Arabia. The amendment adds 2 new categories covering a list of substances that can be diverted from the manufacture of explosives, and a list of precursor chemicals, which are substances that aren't drugs themselves, but are essential for synthesizing narcotics or psychotropic materials. The ministry also took this opportunity to confirm that the 3rd list, containing common industrial chemicals like acetone, hydrochloric acid, and toluene, remains in full effect. These are considered dual use, perfectly legal for industrial use, but heavily monitored because of their potential misuse in illicit labs. There are no changes to the substances on the list, but the enforcement of their tracking remains a top priority. Under these rules, every stage from import and storage to final disposal must be documented. Importers must ensure they have the correct security clearances before shipments arrive at Saudi ports. And this went into effect immediately upon publication on January 5th. And then we'll wrap up in Asia here. On March 19th, China's National Medical Products Administration released the draft for a new GB 7916. And this is intended to replace the nearly 40-year-old hygienic standard for cosmetics. The scope now covers all cosmetic products produced and traded in China, and introduces clear, formalized definitions for categories like children's cosmetics, UV filters, and restricted substances. Manufacturers would no longer be able to rely on finished product testing with a proposed safety assessment alongside hand-in-hand mandatory good manufacturing practices. The draft sets a very high bar for anything used on the eyes, lips, or for children, as well as a large expansion of the prohibited substance list in Appendix A. It is expected to include nearly 1,300 limits, and if a prohibited substance is present as an unavoidable impurity, it must be supported by rigorous safety assessment, proving it won't harm human health. Children's cosmetics are defined as for those aged 12 and under, and they must comply with this new GB standard plus the existing supervision and management provisions. The deadline for feedback is May 18th. Japan's Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare has proposed an update to testing methods under the Act on the Control of Household Products containing harmful substances. One of the most practical changes involves the testing for triphenyltin and tributyltin compounds. Historically, the official method mandated helium as the carrier gas for gas chromatography. But given the global helium shortages and volatility in pricing, Japan is now proposing to allow nitrogen or hydrogen as alternatives. There's also a significant shift, a safety shift in the organic mercury testing protocol. So the protocol phases out the use of carbon tetrachloride, which is itself a highly restricted and hazardous ozone-depleting substance, replacing it with a much safer mixture of cyclohexane and ethyl acetate. This aligns the testing methods with modern green chemistry standards and reduces the regulatory burden on the labs performing these tests. These test methods cover nearly any textile that comes into contact with the body, as well as chemical products like household adhesive, paints, and shoe creams. The consultation period ended on April 3rd, with new methods scheduled to take effect in April of 2027. Thailand has been on a roll updating some of its food contact material standards last quarter. The Ministry of Industry issued a wave of announcements that transitioned many voluntary guidelines into mandatory ISO-aligned industrial standards. Just a few weeks ago, they announced TIS 46474, which specifically addresses recycled PET or rPET for drinking water and beverages. It covers everything from manufacturing requirements to labeling and took effect immediately on March 26th. As far as adopting ISO standards identically, they have reprinted and adopted ISO 4531 for enameled articles, ISO 7086 for glass, and ISO 6486 for ceramics. So this means that the migration limits for lead, cadmium, and other metal ions are now synchronized with international benchmarks. New requirements for food contact paper were originally set to trigger this June. However, following industry feedback, particularly regarding the difficulty of obtaining factory licenses, TISI has proposed a one-year extension. And if enacted, this new enforcement deadline will be June of 2027. Also look out for the new draft inspection criteria for cooking paper, or TIS 3438. Manufacturers will need to show a certified food safety system like HACCP, ISO 22000, or BRC to get licensed. Electronic product information such as a QR code alongside a standard mark will also be required. License holders must now arrange for annual product testing and submit a supplier's declaration of conformity through Thailand's e-surveillance system. On January 26, the National Environment Agency, or NEA, issued a circular formalizing Singapore's commitment to the Stockholm Convention's latest requirements for eliminating persistent organic pollutants. Chlorpyrifos, a widely used insecticide, medium-chain chlorinated paraffins, MCCP, with a chlorination level of 45% or more, common in plastics, sealants, and metalworking fluids, and long-chain PFCAs, which you'll find in everything from specialty coatings to electronics, are being targeted due to their high toxicity and environmental persistence. From December 16th, the manufacture, import, and export of these chemicals and any products containing them is prohibited. If you have legally imported stocks before this December deadline, you are allowed to use them until they are exhausted. However, after that date, no new shipments can enter or leave Singapore. The NEA has stated that they are still developing the local exemption list. In February, Taiwan's Ministry of Environment proposed an amendment that sets out a 3-year roadmap for eliminating mercury from the supply chain. The first phase, with a target date of May 1st, is an immediate import ban on mercury vacuum pumps, satellite propellants, and melt pressure transducers. Self-ballasted fluorescent lamps under 30 watts and lamps for electronic displays are also on the immediate no-go list. The next 2 phases focus heavily on general lighting. By January 2027, CFLs in standard linear fluorescent lamps are out. A year later, in 2028, higher efficiency tri-band phosphor lamps will be banned. Consistent with the Minamata Convention, there is some breathing room for essential services. If a product is critical for military use, civil protection, or specialized research, where no mercury-free substitute is technically viable, you may still be able to import it. And then lastly for me, this slide summarizes briefly some other cosmetic updates for the UK, the Eurasian Economic Union, EAEU, and South Korea, and Malaysia. These guys are cracking down on endocrine disruptors, allergens, and substances with inhalation risks. I'll run through some highlights really quickly, but these are all in C2P, so you can check them out in more detail if you're a subscriber. Major updates include the removal of a camphor compound commonly used as a UV filter from UK, Malaysia, and EAU registers. And then Malaysia has also moved to an immediate ban on miconazole, used as an antifungal preservative in cosmetics. The EAEU draft is prohibited to add over 100 substances and will follow the EU's lead by restricting retinol and kojic acid. The UK is lowering the threshold for formaldehyde warnings to a very strict 0.001%. This means almost any formaldehyde releasing preservative will now require a contains formaldehyde warning on the label. South Korea has added tris biphenyl and triazazine, but with a no aerosol rule and specific nanoparticle size requirements. They're also cleaning up their hair dye list to prevent the use of certain substances with nitrosating agents, which are precursors to carcinogens. And we're also seeing a new focus on product form. The EAEU and South Korea are now distinguishing between rinse-off and leave-on products more strictly, and specifically calling out aerosols and fine powders due to lung inhalation risks. While some Malaysian bans are immediate, most of these changes have a dual deadline structure. For the UK and Korea, pay attention to place on market date versus sell-through date. Generally, you have until mid-2026 to stop manufacturing, but you have until early 2027 to clear existing shelf stock. And that does it for me. I will turn it back over to Emer to see if we have time for any questions.
Thanks so much, Cassie. And thank you everyone for your attention so far. We now have the floor open for the Q&A. If any of you have a question that you would like us to answer, please let us know using the Ask a Question widget to the left side of your screen. Remember, if we don't get to your question today, we will get back to you. I can see we have had a number of questions come in there throughout the webinar. So the first one there that I'm going to put to you, is there still a viable path for specific fluoropolymers outside the EEA?
I can answer that, Emer. The short answer is yes.
Thank you, Cassie.
The short answer is yes, but it's a narrowing path. While the EU REACH proposal uses a group definition that captures thousands of substances, countries like Australia and the UK are still operating on a more substance-specific or subgroup basis. So the strictest common denominator is really likely the way to go moving forward.
Lovely. Thank you, Cassie. I have another one here. Is the Rhode Island microplastics law different than the law proposed last year?
That one's for me.
Lovely. Thank you, Kim.
No, I mean, it's exactly the same. The only thing that has changed are any of the dates associated with it. They have been moved up 1 year to allow for that, to allow for the fact that it's been a year since it was proposed before.
Okay, lovely. Thank you. Thank you, Kim. And I have time for one more. Is there any update about Brazil's REACH regulation?
That one's me too. So no, there isn't. We're just kind of waiting here for that implementing regulation to be published, but there has been no update since the last quarter.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Kim. So thanks again for tuning in with us today. We hope you have found today's presentation helpful, and we look forward to seeing you again in our upcoming webinars. You can check out our resources section on the website to stay updated and to access our latest white papers, blogs, and webinars. We have plenty of upcoming content for you, so make sure you keep an eye out. Our next webinar, Navigating the EU Packaging Regulation Expert Insights and Analysis, is scheduled for May 5th. So be sure to register for that one if you have not done so already, and we hope to see you there. Thank you. Take care.